All right, Alexander, let's talk about the referendums. All the regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and I've even heard Zaporozhye now. They're all pushing for immediate referendums. This is a huge deal. If this happens, immediate referendums, if it happens and they vote to enter the Russian Federation, and if the Russian Federation accepts the results of those referendums, I mean, everything changes. Everything changes, it seems. There are rumors, I don't want to say it's definite, but there are rumors that Vladimir Putin is set to speak with either today or within the next couple of days as well. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, let's just deal with the referendums and we'll take it from there. What does this mean if these things happen?
It is absolutely huge. By the way, just before this video, we started making this video, I saw that the date of these referendums is now put for 23rd to 27th of September. So they're going to happen very, very soon. And you correctly said they're all coordinated with each other. They're all going to happen at about the same time. And the fact that they're happening so quickly shows that they've been prepared over a long time. I mean, you don't just announce a referendum one day and hold it the next. There's clearly been an enormous amount of preparatory work done. Now, you remember, after Kharkiv, after the offensive in Kharkiv, we were debating what the Russians were going to do. We were recognizing that there are major constraints that the Russians have imposed upon themselves with the special military operation. It technically prevented them from attacking infrastructure. It meant that they ceded operational control over much of the war in Donbass to the militia there. Once these referendums are out of the way, once these republics, these regions are incorporated in Russia, all that ends. And we discussed in those programs that, maybe the Russians were thinking of doing something. Maybe they were going to look to upgrade the special military operation into a counter-terrorism operation. This goes much further. If these territories are incorporated in Russia, they become, as far as the Russian state is concerned, Russian. The people who live in them become Russian. At that point, the Russian armed forces are required to defend Russian territory from an encroachment, and that will mean that the militia becomes subordinate to the Russian military command, which will then take over the conduct of the war and will conduct the war in whatever way it considers necessary in order to defend Russian territory. So all those constraints, all those restrictions, all those limitations that have, to a certain extent, to a great extent, constrained the conduct of this special military operation up to now, they will all fall away. We said, you remember we said there was a day, I remember we talked about this, there was a particular day when there was radio silence coming out of Moscow, and it was clear that some kind of discussion was underway there. Well, we now see the outcome of that discussion. They've now decided that these referendums that they've been obviously tinkering about and working towards for a long time, after Kharkiv and importantly after Samarkand, they're now going to take place, and that the special military operation will cease to be one from this moment on, and the Russian armed forces will be given a green light to do whatever they need to do in order to bring this war to an end.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I didn't think about the fact that this would mean the Russian military takes full control of the operation. We're not going to be talking about allies or the Donbass militia and stuff like that. We're going to be talking about the Russian military, and they're going to take over everything with regards to this operation, because a lot of the collective West, they never report the fact that much of this war is being fought and operated by by other forces outside of the professional Russian military. I mean, that's just a fact. And, I'm talking about the Donbass militia, for example. I'm not taking anything away from them, but I'm just saying this is, up until this point, this has been a special military operation which has incorporated different groups into one cohesive unit, which the Russians call the Allies. That's the term that's being used when you look to find information on the internet. It's always the Allies, and they're referring to the Russians did this or that. No one recognizes that in collective West mainstream media. So that's a point well made. There is some debate with regards to the referendums as to whether this was a bottom-up initiative, i.e., did the republics put pressure on the Kremlin to say, look, we need to get into the Russian Federation because we're worried, the shelling, all of these things that have been going on, everything that happened in Kharkov, all of these things. The debate is that the republic said enough, we need to get into the Russian Federation. We need to get in now because we need the protection. Or was this a top-down where, as you noted, the Kremlin had a day of radio silence, they talked about things. I tend to believe that Samarkand was more important than Kharkov,
Yes.
to be honest. And after Samarkand, they said, okay, this is the plan, this is how we're going to do things. What do you believe? Do you think this was a bottom-up or a top-down?
I think
both.
now,
Maybe both.
but it was obviously both. In that the republics, the people in Donbass have wanted this for a very, very long time. I mean, this has been something that they've been floating and talking about and discussing all the way back to 2014. I mean, this isn't something new. And clearly there's been that pressure there, and clearly that's been the ultimate destination point. But it required the Kremlin to make this decision. And I think we should be absolutely clear about this. And by the way, I completely agree with you. Kharkov, I think, played a role, but Samarkand was the most important thing. Now, the reason the Kremlin has not gone along with these referendums up to now, you remember there was that referendum that was going to happen in Kherson region, which didn't happen. And that was a very odd business because there was no other referendum taking place in any other region. And I have to say, looking back, I think that was a trial balloon. I think the Kremlin was floating this idea of referendum in Kherson region, waiting to see what Russia's international partners would say, how they would respond. The response after Putin met Xi, after Putin met Modi, after Putin met Erdogan to some extent, well, I think what has happened is, I think none of these people have said, this is something we welcome, or we're going to come out publicly and support, because, we're not people who want to see international, boundaries violated in this way. We're not people who support secession in this way. But we are intensely relaxed about this thing. It's not going to affect our economic and geopolitical relationship with you. And Putin came away from all these meetings with Xi and with Modi, especially. He gave that press conference, which we've discussed in other programs, where he looked, I thought, very self-confident and very pleased, actually. He clearly felt that things were moving forward. He sent his national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, almost immediately to Beijing. I think it's Beijing, but anyway, he's certainly been meeting with Yang Jiechi, who is the head of, who's Xi Jinping's national security advisor. They're obviously coordinating and discussing things with each other. As I said, I don't think the Chinese have said, well, look, this is something we are welcome. But I think the Chinese have said, look, this is something we're not going to be worried about if you do it. We understand what's led you to this point. The other side has shown that they're completely unreasonable. They won't negotiate. They won't discuss. They won't come up with real proposals. They sabotage the Minsk agreement. They sabotage the agreement that was almost made back in March. So we understand that you want to resolve this thing. You want to do it this way. Well, we're not going to say yes, but we're not going to say no either. So after Samarkand, the Russians have the political space to go ahead and do this. And they've done it. They're now moving very, very fast. So 23rd to 27th, there'll be the referendums. Then there will be a vote in the Russian parliament to decide whether or not to accept the accession of these territories to Russia. That looks like a foregone conclusion. The Speaker of the Duma is supporting these referendums, and he goes to, Putin's party, United Russia. It then goes up to Putin himself. He will address the nation, and after that, we will have no more special military operation. We will have something where the gloves finally and fully come off. And by the way, can I just again repeat the point that you made? Most of the fighting, the greater part of the fighting in Donbass, which is where most of the fighting has happened, has not been between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. It has been between the Donbass militia and the Ukrainian army. The Donbass militia gets artillery support, air support, intelligence, command and control. It's supplemented by groups like the Wagner Group and the Chechen forces. But they've provided the infantry. They've done the infantry fighting in Donbass. Elsewhere, in Kherson region, for example, it is the Russian army. And, I would say that you could actually see a difference. You could see that the Russian army goes about things in a different way from the way that the militia does. And that's not in any way to make any criticisms or comments about anybody. But in Donbass, the epicenter of the battle, it's been the militia that's been fighting, most of the fighting, something which I only came to fully realize a few weeks ago, because as you rightly say, the Western media never mentions it.
Right. And the Ukraine army, the Ukraine infantry gets support from NATO and intelligence from NATO and surveillance from NATO and weapons from NATO, and they get their commands from NATO, and they have NATO mercenaries as well supplementing their infantry. So that is the situation. Everything changes if all these referendums go through as expected, and then Russia accepts the results of those referendums. Turkish President Erdogan said in an interview with PBS NewsHour, he said, "I realized that Russia, are actually trying to finish this conflict as soon as possible. The situation is a big problem." This is what he told PBS NewsHour with regards to his meetings with Putin in Uzbekistan. I wonder if Erdogan realized that Putin was feeling very, very, very good and confident about the talks that he had with world leaders with regards to the referendums, this trial balloon of referendums, and Erdogan kind of picked up on the vibes that Russia is going to ramp things up. Two more questions. Kharkov, no doubt that this has been in the works for a while. I agree. This is not some spontaneous thing. Let's hold a referendum tomorrow and they put it together. This has been in the works for a while. The retreat from Kharkov, the withdrawal from Kharkov was in the works for a while. For a month, 2 months, Russia was drawing down their troop levels. I think there's a connection there in that Russia was preparing the way to create a type of border. And they said, you know what, let's not have any presence in Kharkov. We don't need it, as we may go into a referendum plan. I'm sure they have a lot of plans, probably like 10 plans. But they probably said, my belief, my speculation is that they said, let's not have any troop presence there. We don't need to worry about it just yet. Let's create this Donbass, Kherson type of border.
Exactly.
Just a thought. And finally, what would, and my final question to wrap up the video, what does it mean for Ukraine and the collective West?
Yes. Okay. I on the first point, I think you are absolutely right. I think that's exactly what happened. The Russians have been occupying large areas of Kharkiv region, but they've never set up the kind of governmental structures that they've set up in Kherson region, for example. They've never treated Kharkiv in that kind of way. And I think they never had a plan to hold a referendum there. There's never been any talk about doing that. So, given that they are now moving towards referendums in the two Donbass republics and in Kherson region and in parts of Zaporozhye region, they took a decision that they were going to pull out of Kharkov, in part because they didn't want to be in a position where people in Kharkov started saying, well, look, you're having referendums in those other places. Why not logically have referendums in our region as well? Now, eventually, in time, the Russians might decide that they want to return to Kharkov region. They might decide they want to go on to Nikolaev or to Odessa. But at the moment, they want to stick by these core territories because those are the territories that the original special military operation was all about. Once that's out of the way, then you can decide whatever you need to do because, as I said, it's the military has to make its own decisions. Now, you're also absolutely right by your other point, which is one that I think people have not understood, which is the extent to which this has been a proxy war. Now, the Russians are physically present in Ukraine. They have troops there. They have troops in Kherson region. Those troops are undertaking a lot of the fighting. But most of the fighting in Donbass, where most of the fighting has been happening, on the ground, has been conducted by the Donbass militia. The Ukrainian army, which at some levels is not so different, it seems to me, from the Donbass militia, actually, is also supported to the equivalent degree by the collective West. Once Russia becomes directly involved, the proxy war ends. It is a straightforward war between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the collective West has been supporting Ukraine. So at that point, this army that they've put together in Ukraine has to take on the Russian army. It's not shown much success when it's really come up against the Russian army in places like Kherson up to now. It puts them in an incredibly difficult position. Do they escalate? Do they draw down? Well, they can't really realistically draw down. Do they accept the probability of Ukraine being defeated? What do they do? The one thing, of course, they won't do is accept it. They're going to be a howl of anger. They're going to say that this proves that this war was a war of aggression all along, that Russia's objective all along was to conquer these territories, and this is a war of aggression against Ukraine. They can't back off from that now. They can't seek the compromise that up to this moment was there. I mean, the point about the referendums is that one of the points about the referendums is that they now rule out the option of the kind of negotiations that the Russians have been trying to set up in the past. That's over. Once these referendums happen, once these territories are in the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, says no Russian official at that point can reverse that decision. So the collective West will howl, they will be furious, they will undoubtedly look to impose more sanctions. What do they do on the military side? That's the real question. Because, of course, from that point on, if they continue to escalate, then it's no longer a proxy war. It becomes much more a direct military confrontation between the West and Russia, which it has been up to a point, up to now, but it will be much more so then. So this can make everything more dangerous.
Right. Just to clarify, once the referendums, if the referendums happen and if Russia decides to incorporate these areas into the Russian Federation, it doesn't mean that Russia has to mobilize or declare war. Is that correct? Not at all.
Not at all.
That doesn't mean that.
No, it doesn't mean that. That's not what it means at all. What it means is that the Russian army has unrestricted control over how to conduct the war. The militia becomes subordinated to the Russian army and will eventually be, in time, absorbed by it. But it will cease to be an independent force in theory, the armed forces of what are supposed to be two independent states. It will no longer be that in Russian eyes any longer. So it doesn't mean mobilization. It doesn't mean mobilization of the economy. It doesn't mean mobilization, a massive enlistment of young people, all that kind of thing that people have been talking about. I don't think we're going to see any mobilization at all of that kind. Some reservists may be called up. But then, as I said previously, when the United States sends its forces around the world, it sends National Guard troops too, and they call up reservists into the National Guard. So this isn't something, extraordinary or unusual. I don't think there's going to be a dramatic increase in mobilization at all. I just don't see that. But it does mean that the Russian command can start to do things that it hasn't been able to do up to now, like, for example, attack command centers.
Right, exactly. And two more final questions, and that's it. How do you answer the question that many people may have, saying, well, the Ukraine military has attacked Russian territory already, i.e. Crimea or Belgorod or stuff like that, and Russia hasn't really done much of anything. So why would this be any different? That's one question. And to end the video, and I know you're a little under the weather, but 5 more minutes of your time to end the video. International law. If other countries, say for example Syria, recognizes the fact that Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye are now part of the Russian Federation, does that carry the same precedent as the case of Kosovo and Metohija?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's. Do
you understand the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I understand the question. Let's deal with these two issues first of all. Firstly, and this is an very important point. Yes, there's been shelling on Belgorod region. There's threats of missile strikes now at Kursk region. There's been attacks on Crimea, which of course Russia considers to be part of its own territory. All of this has been going on already, and the Russians have shown great restraint in responding. The reason they've shown restraint in responding up to this moment in time is because the armed forces in Ukraine, the Russian armed forces in Russia, are constrained by the terms of the special military operation, which is a military operation to provide support to the militias of the two Donbass republics in order to defend themselves in accordance with a treaty, a defense treaty that Russia and these two Donbass republics signed and agreed with each other back in February. That all ends the moment those republics are incorporated into Russia. You can't have a treaty with yourself. These countries no longer exist as countries. They become a part of Russia. The special military operation ends because the special military operation presupposes the existence of two independent states that you are assisting. So, given that fighting will continue in Donbass, that is a given. Given that the armed forces of the two Donbass republics will become, at that point, a part of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. That means that the Russian armed forces, Russia itself, are already committed to a war. Now, I say a war, I mean, there won't be a declaration of war, but to military actions in their own, in self-defense, in defense of Russian territory itself, the kind of actions that under the United Nations Charter, countries are allowed to take in order to protect themselves from a threat to their security. So the whole dynamic changes entirely. It shifts, even though, as I said, there have been these attacks on Belgorod, on Crimea. What stood in the way, if you like, of that major response has been the special military operation, which the Kremlin has stuck with. But with the incorporation of these territories, the special military operation ends entirely. It ceases to exist, and the Russian military are free to do whatever it judges it needs to do in order to defend the territory and people of Russia. Now that's the first point. Now the second point, can you just remind me, as you rightly said, I'm a little under the weather.
Kosovo, Metohija,
Kosovo, yeah, all of
is
that,
that precedent?
Yeah.
If a country like Syria recognizes this referendum, an
Yes.
outside country,
Yes.
does that?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, it does. I mean, if you read the advisory opinion on Kosovo, that is entirely legal, as Putin never ceases to say. I mean, if a territory can succeed from one country, and that's consistent with international law, then there is no reason why, equally consistently with international law, it can't vote or decide to join up with a different country. It's up to that country. It's its own sovereign decision. If you accept the advisory opinion on Kosovo as a correct expression of international law, I personally don't. But the Western powers have
Their
done.
rules.
Their rules. They lobbied for it. They actually pushed for this decision. They wanted this decision. They got this decision. And we see how it's coming back to bite them.
Yeah. All right. We'll end it there. The Duran.locals.com. Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.